When I think of Los Angeles, the things that immediately come to mind are things like the Hollywood sign and the Sunset Strip and Beverly Hills, Santa Monica Pier, Venice Boardwalk, Dodger Stadium, USC, UCLA, LAX. All of those things are located in a geographic area called the LA Basin.
The Los Angeles Basin is a lowland area bordered by the Santa Monica Mountains in the northwest, the Santa Ana Mountains in the southeast, and the Pacific Ocean to the west.
But there's an arm of the Santa Monica Mountains that randomly juts out, forming a second lowland area just north of the LA Basin. The second lowland area is called the San Fernando Valley, or simply, the Valley. And even though the Valley is in fact included within the city limits of Los Angeles, and even though Hollywood has a significant presence in the Valley, like CBS, Warner Brothers, the Disney Lot, and Universal Studios, the Valley has always kind of been thought of as a distinct, separate entity from Los Angeles or Hollywood. When Inherent Vice came out in 2014, Molly Lambert wrote an article for Grantland called "The Valley Plays Itself," in which she said, "The Valley's reputation in Los Angeles is a bit like New Jersey's in New York. People in Los Angeles proper are known to hate on the Valley for being 10 degrees hotter, for its supposed lack of culture, and for being far away, mostly psychologically. But if you've grown up there, you find that these hang-ups are irrelevant. The Valley is its own creature, part of Los Angeles, but also a world of its own."
This is for the Valley.
Paul Thomas Anderson is famously one such person who grew up here in the Valley, here in Studio City specifically. Even though the Valley has always had a presence in pop culture, from being the porn capital of the world in the 70s, to Valley Girl, to Tom Petty songs, to the Valley Party and Clueless, Paul Thomas Anderson's movies over the last 25 years have, for some, become the biggest pop cultural touch points for the Valley. 3 of his first 4 movies famously take place here, and he wrote those movies as love letters to the Valley despite, or maybe because of, its reputation as the little brother of LA and Hollywood. He saw it as a special place even if others didn't necessarily. But because he saw it as a special place, and he made several great enduring movies that are inextricably tied to the Valley, he made other people realize it's a special place. Personally, when I think of the Valley, the first things that come to mind are Boogie Nights and Magnolia. And that it's hot here. You may notice that so many of the reviews of Licorice Pizza talk about the movie, but also talk about Paul Thomas Anderson and the Valley. There's a reason for that. There's a reason I'm doing that right now. Here's one of the Valley's most famous sons, the poet laureate of the Valley, returning home to make his first Valley movie in almost 20 years. That's certainly notable. But on top of that, the setting, I think, tells you quite a bit about the story and about the characters. Again, the Valley is a suburban sprawl just on the other side of the hill from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, LA, and the place where stuff happens. So it simultaneously feels like a place that's on the cusp of something, a place where you've almost made it, but it also feels like a dead end. Gary Valentine is 15 years old, but feels closer to 30, and he tries to act as such. He lives in Sherman Oaks, but he's had some minor success as a child actor, and he's always hustling. If ever leaving the Valley is what he wants, he's well on his way. Alana Kane is a 20-something woman living with her parents and sisters in Encino. She doesn't have a lot of prospects, is in a bit of arrested development, and is basically going nowhere fast and not leaving Encino anytime soon. Like the Valley itself, Gary is on the cusp of something. He's almost made it. But Alana feels like she's in a dead end. The movie opens with a wonderful meet cute on school picture day at the local high school. This high school, actually. When Gary notices, approaches, and sweet talks the board photographer's assistant, Alana. For a movie that's implicitly nostalgic, based on the fact that it's set in the past, it's about younger people, and it takes place in a specific location where the writer-director grew up, I think it's kind of clever to begin the movie on picture day. Yearbooks are explicitly nostalgic, capturing a year, marking time with pictures. It basically exists just so you can look back on it and be nostalgic. Putting this in the opening scene leans into that nostalgic aspect, and I like that. Gary lets you know who he is within the first 2 minutes, as he tries to convince Alana to have dinner with him by listing his acting credits. Alana tells him no, but is also intrigued. She shows up to dinner, but explicitly tells him it's not a date, multiple times. Why she ultimately shows up is open to interpretation, but I think it's because she likes the attention, particularly the attention of someone with seemingly so many prospects, having so few herself.
What are your plans?
I don't know.
What's your future look like?
I don't know.
One of my favorite pieces of film criticism from the whole year was what Lauren Wilford wrote about Licorice Pizza on Letterboxd. And it's hard to pick a single quote because honestly every sentence is pretty brilliant, but I'll go with this. If you are not supposed to be desired by someone who nevertheless desires you, you must presumably be desirable indeed. Being a forbidden crush object is a high amperage emotional experience, and if two people can provide that for one another, they can generate enough voltage to power their lives on for a while. Again, Alana sets explicit boundaries from the get-go. This isn't a date, they're not boyfriend, girlfriend, etc., but they just want to be around each other. You get the sense that Gary's interest in pursuing Alana is maybe just as simple as seeing if he can get her to go out with him. He pursues her just to see if it'll work. But that evolves. In Act 1, she acts as his chaperone on a child actor trip to New York for a movie reunion song and dance thing, during which Gary pulls a prank on stage just to amuse Alana. That's telling. You can begin to see that a lot of the things Gary does, multiple entrepreneurships, doing some pretty bold things to piss off Jonathan Peters, all these things he does largely to impress Alana. Alana's interest in Gary is apparently harder to pinpoint, but I think, for one, she's very bored, if we're being honest. But for two, she feels like Gary is going places, and she wants to go places too, because she's otherwise not going anywhere.
What are you doing? What are you thinking, huh? I'm Essie. I work for Mom and Dad. I'm perfect. I'm a real estate agent. Alana doesn't have her life together. Alana brings home stupid boyfriends all the time.
I mean,
I knew it. I knew that was what you were thinking. You're always thinking things, you thinker. You thinker. You think things.
Gary and Alana end up going to business together after Gary is talked into starting a waterbed business by Leonardo DiCaprio's dad. Seriously, George DiCaprio plays the guy who sells Gary his first waterbed. So Gary, ever the go-getter, starts this company and makes Alana his partner. From there, Gary and Alana have various misadventures, some waterbed related, some not. Some together, some apart. With the constant of Gary always trying to act more like an adult than he is, and Alana trying to prove to herself and others that she is actually an adult.
God, teenagers!
Throughout, Gary and Alana keep one-upping each other and embarrassing themselves in front of each other to varying degrees. And there's a constant back and forth, a push-pull. They repel and attract. A trick the movie plays is that it sort of sells itself as a two-hander, both in the trailers and in the first act, but it's secretly really Alana's movie. Gary doesn't have much of an arc. He's just a 15-year-old waiting around to be an adult. There's not a ton of change there. It's Alana who grows and changes and makes decisions and learns things about herself and the world around her. It's a mutual coming-of-age story, but ironically, more so for the adult and less so for the kid. Hey there, champ. I hear there's been quite a bit of discourse around this movie. Well, that's okay. Discourse is nothing to be embarrassed about, and in fact, it's a perfectly natural part of modern media consumption. But before you engage in discourse, just make sure that you're informed about it. And as always, keep an open mind and an open heart. Come on, champ. Let's get through this discourse together. So, I said a bit ago that Alana's interest in Gary is apparently harder to pinpoint than Gary's interest in Alana. Gary's interest in Alana is pretty explicitly romantic, and it would seem many viewers take Alana's interest in Gary as an indication that she reciprocates his feelings. Thus, many people are taking issue with an apparent romance between a 15, 16-year-old kid and a woman who's either 25 or 28, depending on who's asking her. Let me go on record and say, on principle, I also take issue with romances between adults and children, as everyone should. And I guess the reason I don't really take issue with Gary and Alana is because I don't really see it as a romance, more of a friendship with a one-sided crush. I never get the sense that Alana is sexually attracted to Gary, much to his chagrin, and even in her lowest moments, I don't think she ever entertains that idea. To again quote Lauren Wilford's piece, is it romantic? Is it a love story? Kind of. Structurally, it's a romance. It seems very clear to me that it's about attraction, but not about sexual attraction per se. More about what infatuation represents, existentially. Infatuation is about wanting someone, about being pulled toward them like a magnet, but it's also about your magnetic pull on them. If it's a romance, it's among the most chaste on-screen romances you're ever likely to find. Whether or not you want to semantically call it a romance, they establish explicit boundaries from the get-go, like I've said, and their relationship stays within those boundaries. For the most part. Without getting too specific, there are certainly lines that should not be crossed when an adult is hanging out with a 16-year-old. And in the specific case of Gary and Alana, not trying to make any sweeping generalizations here, just solely talking about these two people, personally, I never thought a line was crossed, but your mileage may vary with that. YouTuber Broe Deschanel, great name, has an excellent video on depiction versus endorsement when it comes to age gaps in movies, with an emphasis on the importance of framing and how different movies frame these relationships. For different examples, she goes deep on Adrian Lyne's Lolita remake, Lou Guadagnino's Call Me By Your Name, and Licorice Pizza. As far as Licorice Pizza goes, she's with me in the it's not really a romance camp. And her conclusion about the age gap discourse is that people are probably upset because the movie's framing doesn't make an explicit condemnation of their relationship, and instead takes more of a neutral stance and leaves room for the audience to draw their own conclusions. And that might be where Paul Thomas Anderson gets in trouble, because the other major discourse around the movie is in regard to a scene where a white character uses a racist and offensive accent when speaking to a Japanese character. From what I've seen, there thankfully isn't really any disagreement about the fact that that's a bad thing and that people shouldn't use racist accents, but there's a contingency of people that think that this has no business in the movie, and that includes some people who otherwise really like the movie. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's a contingency of people saying, well, this was the 1970s, and this was the kind of racist bullshit Asian people and people of color in general had to deal with at the time, and it's just depicting 1973, warts and all. For his part, Paul Thomas Anderson told Kyle Buchanan of the New York Times, I think it would be a mistake to tell a period film through the eyes of 2021. You can't have a crystal ball, you have to be honest to that time. And I've seen people in the first contingency saying, okay, fine, but just because the 70s were more racist doesn't mean you need to make your movie racist, especially when it's just racist for the sake of it and it's not adding anything to the movie. It's really just that last part that I want to comment on. While I completely understand why this part of the movie bothers people, if you're going to talk about the merits of the scene and what it does or doesn't add to the movie, we at least have to be honest about the scene's context and content. Gary and his mom do marketing for local businesses, including for a local Japanese restaurant co-owned by a white man named Jerry and his Japanese wife, Miyoko. Based on real people, by the way. Gary's mom reads them some ad copy for their approval. Jerry loves it, and he asks Miyoko what she thinks, racistly. But it's important to note that Jerry doesn't realize he's being racist. It's not vitriolic or mean-spirited. That is legitimately how he thinks he's supposed to communicate with his Japanese wife. Both times I saw this in theaters, this moment got a decent amount of laughs from the audience. But the movie's framing is not, haha, what a funny accent. It's very clearly, haha, what a fucking idiot. The movie is showing us that Jerry is a buffoon, but it's also going out of its way to show us that Miyoko is the smarter, more business-savvy person in the marriage. It's notably Miyoko and not Jerry who recognizes how the first version of the ad copy sells the waitresses in a creepy way instead of the food. And it's clearly Miyoko and not Jerry who recognizes the potential for Japanese cuisine in Los Angeles, which was considered exotic at the time, per the ad copy in the scene. And because we're in the future, we know she was very correct about the prospects of Japanese food in Los Angeles, and in the US at large. So while Miyoko is clearly savvy and Jerry is clearly an idiot, it is the 1970s. Miyoko's in a country where she doesn't really speak the language, apparently Japanese food is a hard sell, and most businesses are run by white men. So there's probably no way Miyoko gets this business off the ground without having Jerry there as kind of a necessary idiot to be the face of the business while she quietly makes the decisions and actually runs things. She needs him and is therefore forced to put up with him. This whole scene, including and especially his racist accent, is a commentary on that and how much BS these women had to take. But we're very much on her side. So it takes a wee bit of reading between the lines, but that's what I got on the narrative purpose of the scene. Whether that purpose is enough to justify the scene's inclusion, your mileage may vary. But I don't think you have to read between the lines at all to understand the intention here. We're supposed to laugh at what a fucking idiot this guy is, because the framing and context make that abundantly clear, and PTA has confirmed that in multiple interviews. Whether or not that context matters or that intention matters, again, your mileage may vary. I know some people think that the intention doesn't matter because a non-zero but hopefully minuscule number of viewers will take the racism as permission to laugh at the stereotype and not at the stupidity. To which I say, yeah, that sucks. Lana Wachowski just made a whole-ass movie directly reckoning with the fact that a bunch of shitheads took the exact opposite intended message from a movie she made 20 years ago. No one in Licorice Pizza ever looks on the barrel of the lens and says, Romantic relationships between adults and children are bad. Racism is bad. Failing that, there will always be shitheads with no media literacy at all who will take the wrong message. It's the price of subtlety. Alright, let's dig the review out of this hole. Speaking of not spoon-feeding the audience, all 4 movies Paul Thomas Anderson has made since There Will Be Blood have caused me to ask, in some way or another, what is this? I don't know what to make of The Master. A lot of people whose opinions I trust think it's among the best movies of the 21st century, but I don't know what to make of it. I've seen it like 5 times at this point. I rewatch it every couple of years hoping it'll eventually click with me, and it just hasn't clicked with me. Similarly, I can't make heads or tails of Inherent Vice, but I've also kind of accepted that maybe I'm not supposed to be able to make heads or tails of it. Phantom Thread I saw twice in theaters and made a 10-minute video about on this channel, but it wasn't until a third viewing nearly a year later, after the movie had percolated through the culture for a while, did I realize, oh, this is just a romantic comedy disguised as a stuffy drama. That's what this is. I have not yet had a similar epiphany about The Master or Inherent Vice. Like, I get that Inherent Vice is a convoluted stoner detective story that's frustratingly complicated by design, and I get that The Master is about a lost soul who is a fundamentally dangerous person, and the grifter who is able to take the lost soul under his wing because he offers him a sense of direction, and maybe more importantly, a sense of belonging. And it took me like 4 viewings just to get that far. But even understanding these basic premises, I still struggle with what the movie is doing, with why the story is being told the way that it is, with how the characters are moving through the story, with how the flow of scenes makes sense. And that's probably the biggest thing, actually, is wrapping my head around the narrative flow, understanding the point of a given scene and how it flows into the next one. And because I struggle with it, that leaves me asking, what is this? If you've watched Licorice Pizza, there's maybe a decent chance these questions I have about The Master and Inherent Vice ring true, and they're questions you also have about Licorice Pizza. A lot of people seem to like the movie, some definitely don't, but even those that like it might still be asking, what is this? If you want a basic premise in the same vein of what I just described for PTA's last 3 movies, I've basically already said it. It's a mutual coming-of-age story for a kid who feels like he's already a grown-up and an adult who doesn't yet feel like a grown-up. In terms of what the movie is doing, how the story is told, and how the characters move through the story, the narrative flow, etc., I definitely noticed more structure and more cohesion between the scenes on second watch. And that structure and cohesion is mostly built around that constant back and forth, push-pull, repulsion attraction that I mentioned a while ago. It's not apparent, like I said, subtle, not spoon-feeding you, etc., but if you're looking at it in the right way, the narrative flow will become more clear. Here's an example of the narrative flow of like 3 or 4 scenes. After Gary and Alana become partners in his mattress business, Alana runs into an old acquaintance, also an adult woman, who knows Gary from seeing him around. And when Alana tells this acquaintance that she and Gary are business partners, with a small but notable swell of pride, the acquaintance asks Alana if Gary has asked her for a yet, implying that's maybe a common thing that he does. This rattles Alana. Number 1, is the person she's hitching her wagon to not actually a mature go-getter who's going places, but actually just a regular pervy dime-a-dozen teenage boy? And number 2, was she a complete idiot for letting this boy make her feel special by giving her his attention? Is she not the first person that Gary has noticed, approached, and sweet-talked? Granted, none of these things are said. Alana is certainly rattled, but it entirely plays out in wordless reaction. After Alana has this conversation with the acquaintance, I believe the very next shot is her driving Gary home, and she slowly turns and looks at him with her jaw clenched, considers him for a beat, and then slowly turns back to the road. And everything I just said about how and why Alana is rattled is communicated in that slow turn and look. In the next scene, Gary and Alana are back at the mattress offices attempting cold call sales. Alana is on the phone with a man who doesn't seem interested in buying, and Gary tells her to add more pizzazz to her sales pitch, to be sexier. And Alana thinks, F you, you little twerp, you don't know anything about sex or what's sexy. But fine, if you want sexy, I'll give you sexy. Then her sales call with this reluctant guy becomes inappropriately and comically sultry. And it works. She makes the sale while Gary watches on with his jaw on the floor. Again, none of this is said. I'm adding Alana's interior monologue that I'm gleaning from the narrative. The movie then cuts to Gary taking Alana to meet with his acting agent. And the dot you're supposed to connect is that while Gary was a little mad that Alana acted a little inappropriately to make that sale, more than anything, he was impressed by her performance and thought, let's get you some acting gigs. Once again, he doesn't say this. You're connecting that dot yourself. But it is helped by the fact that he did say,
You're an actress. You should be an actress.
But that was like 30 or 40 minutes earlier. During this meeting with the acting agent, Gary gets upset when Alana says she's willing to do nudity for a role because she's been unwilling to show Gary her chest. It's an incredibly immature reaction because he is, after all, still a teenage boy. And it's this that sparks her to do this.
Do you really want to see my boobs?
Can I touch them?
See you tomorrow.
Returning to the discourse real quick, and advisedly, notice that this scene in context is entirely devoid of romance or sexuality. It's clinical, matter-of-fact, begrudging. It's more about restoring the balance in their friendship and partnership in a weird way. That said, please don't expose yourself to minors. What I hope I demonstrated by walking through those scenes is twofold. One, that push-pull between Gary and Alana. They're constantly bouncing between bettering each other and driving each other crazy. And both of them are pretty equally responsible for the latter through various insecurities and immaturities. The other thing I hope these scenes demonstrate is that there is, in fact, narrative flow. That there is, in fact, a cause and effect relationship happening between these scenes, even if it's not immediately obvious. The thing is, though, even after one viewing, before I could articulate all that, and before I really had a grasp on how the movie was working, I already knew I loved the movie. Admittedly, kind of the whole point of this channel is for me to explain why I like certain movies, but some movies do just have that power, that they are super enjoyable and great in a way that's sometimes hard to articulate. Luckily, our modern times has given us a word for that. The vibes are immaculate in Licorice Pizza. I just really enjoy spending time in this world with these characters. It's a great hang. Yes, there's more going on in the narrative than meets the eye, but you don't really need to dig into that to like the movie, because the vibes are reason enough. The thing is, though, this channel being what it is, I can't just say, immaculate vibes, roll credits, because vibes don't happen by accident. It is a combination of cinematography, music, editing, and, if we're being honest, charm and performances that all coalesce to create the atmosphere that people respond to. Sure, there are definitely some shots in this movie that are compositionally and intellectually interesting. Brianna Ziegler wrote about this shot from the opening scene in Paste magazine, where Alana has Gary literally in the palm of her hand. And while she's taken by Gary in this opening scene, it's really a reflection of Gary that she's taken with. A reflection hinged on an extension of oneself that manifests as an idea of romance. But a lot of my favorite shots aren't really things I can intellectualize. They're just indelible images that make me sigh contently. They work on me in a way I can't explain, but who cares? The important thing is that they work on me. The needle drops pretty much speak for themselves and are wildly effective. Bowie, Nina Simone, The Doors, and the McCartney needle drop is probably my favorite 2 minutes I've seen in a movie in a long time. Good time to remind everyone that Paul Thomas Anderson has directed a lot of great music videos for Fiona Apple, for Radiohead, for Haim.
Tell me a word that when people mispronounce, it drives you up the wall.
Hyam.
It's Hyam.
It's Hyam.
For Fiona Apple, for Radiohead, for Haim. The dude knows how to put incredible visuals to music and vice versa. That's especially apparent in Licorice Pizza, which is easily his most soundtrack-heavy movie since Boogie Nights. Interestingly enough, his editor on Licorice Pizza, Andy Jurgensen, is his longtime editor on all of his music videos. And while Jurgensen was an assistant editor on Inherent Vice and an associate editor on Phantom Thread, Licorice Pizza is his first feature film credit as lead editor. I've already sort of indirectly commented on Jurgensen's structural macro editing when I talked about narrative flow, the scene-to-scene editing, but I also really enjoy the micro editing, like the stuff within a given scene. I like how much silence there is. Yes, there's a notable scene in the trailer where Gary and Alana are on the phone and neither says anything, and there's the scene I already mentioned when Alana is driving Gary and just turns and looks without saying anything, but even beyond stuff like that, how much of a pause the actors will take between lines of dialogue, how much space there is between the words. It's extremely easy to overlook, but I think it adds some real verisimilitude to the interactions. It makes the conversation seem more natural, which is all the more impressive because the two leads, Cooper Hoffman as Gary and Alana Haim as Alana, Alana Haim as Alana, they're both first-time actors. Sure, Alana's been in some music videos and has appeared as herself alongside her bandmates in like Documentary Now and stuff like that, but this is her first movie and certainly her first meaty role. And Cooper Hoffman has never acted in anything. This is his first acting credit, period, full stop. Granted, it's not like he's never been on a film set, as his father was the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, who was both a longtime collaborator of Paul Thomas Anderson and quite possibly the greatest actor of his generation. PTA wrote the script with Alana Haim in mind, as he's been directing her and her sisters in Haim music videos for a few years now, but he claims he did not have Cooper Hoffman in mind while writing Gary. However, PTA has also known Cooper since he was 3 days old, being such good friends with his dad, so when the time came for him to cast this precocious 15-year-old, it probably didn't take long for him to realize, I already know a precocious 15-year-old. Maybe he could do it. PTA was nominated for Best Director here, and he's probably not going to win, but I want to take this moment to say that debut performances from first-time actors are so rarely, if ever, this good. And that doesn't just happen. You have to believe a lot of it is directing. It's rare you see characters as likable but flawed as Gary and Alana. A lot of media has high schoolers, but high schoolers are hard to get right. They're often too precocious or too written by adults. Gary is precocious, but you can see right through it. It's a bit of a put-on. And he's so lovable, but he's also a lot sometimes. That's a hard line to walk. It's why I like Max Fisher. He's lovable, but he's also a little shit sometimes. Gary seems so familiar to me, even though we don't have a lot in common and I didn't really know anyone like him. But it feels like I did, because he feels so real and lived in. Though one thing I do really relate to is how he sees himself, and his often misplaced sense of adulthood. When I was 15 and 16, I definitely thought I knew a thing or two and thought I was ready to take on the world. I was not. Alana feels real and lived in too. There's such specificity to her character, and by extension to her family, played by her real-life parents and sisters.
Gotta stop fighting with everyone all the time.
Oh, f*** off, Danielle.
There's certainly a lot to dislike about Alana, but you still really like her because she's really endearing, and that's also a hard line to walk. It's why I like Lady Bird so much. And while I definitely relate to Gary because I too thought I was an adult when I was 15, I conversely relate to Alana even more. Shortly after the movie opened on one screen in Los Angeles, I saw this tweet that said, "Licorice Pizza is a movie about how being 25 sucks big time." That sounds tongue-in-cheek, but it's also shockingly accurate. Again, Alana is still living at home, has no real prospects, and is in Arrested Development. A big part of what attracts her to Gary is that, despite him being 15, she ironically sees him as a path to adulthood, because he has his shit together way more than she does, or at least pretends to. And when Gary's immaturity inevitably comes out, and they enter the push phase of their push-pull relationship, Alana runs to older men, namely a William Holden stand-in played by Sean Penn. But what we quickly learn, or already knew, is that hanging out with older men does not magically make you an adult. And what Alana quickly learns is that these grown men are more immature and more childish than even Gary is. And that puts Gary and Alana back into a pull phase of their push-pull relationship. The point is, Alana is at a precarious age where she's not a kid anymore, but her life also doesn't really feel like it's started yet. She's an adult, but only in age, not in maturity or purpose. I weirdly relate to that. It doesn't make any sense. When I was 25, I had my own apartment and a good job, but I still felt like a kid a lot of the time. Hell, even now, I'm 32 and I have a wife and a mortgage, but part of me still feels like I'm 17 and just pretending to be an adult every day. So Alana, you may not believe me, but I feel you, girl. And maybe that's the whole thing. You wouldn't think on paper that I would personally relate to Alana, but I do. You wouldn't think that I would relate so hard to both Gary and Alana, because that seems contradictory, but I do. If you've seen the movie, maybe you don't see much story to speak of in this shaggy hangout movie, but I do. Or maybe you assume people would be hesitant to like the movie because there are some problematic elements, but I do. And maybe the setting is a little too specific and not universal enough for audiences to buy in, but I do. And hopefully in all this rambling, someone somewhere was able to find some merit in Licorice Pizza, but if not, that's okay. This movie might as well have been tailor-made for me. And basically from the second the trailer dropped and that Bowie song started playing over shots of Alana walking in front of sprinklers in the bright morning sun, it was a foregone conclusion that this was going to be my favorite movie of the year. I hyped it up so much in my head that I was a little worried it was going to let me down, but it didn't, at all. This was a movie I wanted so desperately to love, and I do.
But the film is a sad thing for she's lived it 10 times or more.